Thank you very much. Kaya nang Jerupamaman Janunu Nidja, Nyang Karich Wurundjeri, Buddha Maman, Buddha Yoga. I pay respect to traditional owners past and present here. My name is Braden Hill. I am the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Students Equity and Indigenous at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Western Australia. You might have heard of Perth. You might know where it is. It's a fair way away. The time difference is 3 hours, but right now it feels like 13, so bear with me, not because of the conference, just because I'm not sleeping particularly well. Now, I'm supposed to have a clicker here. This is my clicker, I think. Is that right? Okay. I'm a Wadanti Noongar, which means I'm from the southwest of Western Australia. Fantastic wine country. I live and work on Whadjuk country, though. And I come from a big family. If you're an Aussie Rules follower, I come from the Hill family. We have about 3 players who have made it to AFL. And of course, that means in the Hill family, I'm a bit of a family disappointment because I became the disappointing professor. Now, Professor Coldrake asked me to kind of be the energising voice at the end of the conference, and as I said, I'm feeling a bit jet-lagged, so I'll do my best. I bought some pom-pom, but I must say, I'm very excited because I'm living my Madonna, Britney Spears, Lady Gaga fantasy, and I'm sure they would have all been super excited to be on the centre stage of Texa. What I'd like to kind of point out is probably a comment that was made at the beginning, the first session that Stuart, our student speaker, he made the comment at the beginning that said, in gaming, we assume that everybody knows how to play the game. I don't think we're much different in the higher education sector. I think we like to assume that students know how to engage and play the game, but I don't know if that's, I think that's true for us as well. And the reason why I say that, and what I'm going to talk to you about today, really is about equity. And I think my argument is that to craft a fairer future, we certainly need to be thinking and understanding equity. And I'd really like to kind of challenge and perhaps reframe the way we think about that as a sector, particularly as somebody who is an ATAR dropout, somebody who is an enabling course graduate, an Aboriginal kid coming into a very white academy. I appreciate the benefits of really sharp intentional, purposeful thinking around equity. So I'll move us on. I do come from Edith Cowan University. We're the #1 public university for teaching quality and student experience. I can claim no credit for that because I'm very new in my role, but I will anyway. The 3 people on this screen you'll see as stock footage everywhere, right? But they are 2 of the students that I've taught who came through enabling pathways, who are now graduates, who I'm very, very proud of. And I still think of myself as a teacher fundamentally, and I don't think I'll stop thinking about that. So, fairness requires equity. Equity requires action. Action requires leadership. And leadership requires courage. We need to have the courage to include, and I'm talking to leaders primarily, we're all leaders at various levels, but we have to have the courage to include, the courage to be challenged. We have to be okay with being uncomfortable sometimes. That was my 3rd slide, I knew that 3rd point. I think we also have to think about how we develop relationships of responsibility. And what I mean by that is having relationships with people, with communities, with industries, with partners, where we have a responsibility for mutual success. And I think we really need to think critically and intentionally about that. I also think we need to think really critically about how we acknowledge and de-centre privilege within the academy. I think that's really important for somebody who's Aboriginal, in the university sector particularly. I've been in universities for about 15 years now, and I can count literally on one hand the amount of colleagues that I would consider full and proper allies. So being able to acknowledge and de-centre privilege, I think, is really important, and it's a courageous act. One of the things that I think is also vital is that we acknowledge that equity is not just about demographics. We tend to think about equity in terms of demographics. We talk about equity in terms of student need. And these aren't incorrect, but I think these are the dominant understandings in the way in which we think about it. It's not just about knowing the whole student. It's not just about knowing staff needs. It's not just about knowing our colleagues and their whole selves. And I think most importantly, it's really important to remember that equity is not the destination. I think we often think about equity as being the destination, but for me, it's actually the journey, okay? And what I want to talk about is equity really is the journey towards what I think is the topic of the talk today, a fairer future. In order for us to get to a fairer future, we need to understand, but we also need to do equity. And that means giving people what they need to succeed. It's also about making sure that we are doing things that identify and remedy inequality. It's an action. And sometimes the most important bit of that action, I would argue, is that we are able to reprioritise to enable equal access to things like power, education, information, and resources. So, as I say, it's about doing something, okay? It's not just about knowing communities or knowing particular cohorts. We actually have to do something. So, we often think about equity. Everybody knows the crates on the box looking over the fence, and some people say we should just smash the fence. Yes, absolutely. But I think in terms of the way I like to think about it in terms of resources is this kind of model. So we have equality on one side where you see differing areas of need within communities, and on the other side you see additional resources going to places that need it. And I think that's probably a healthy way of kind of holding that framing as I talk through the rest of today. Now, this is where I start to get a bit provocative and controversial, so bear with me, everybody, but I think that is part of my job here. I want to talk about power, and I want to talk about who has it in our sector. As I said, bear with me. In a study, 94% of those serving on Australian university governing councils were white. 94% of top-tier university senior executives in Australia were also white. And 96% of Australian Vice-Chancellors in Australian universities also identified as white. Now, I read the study. They kind of don't really differentiate between Caucasian and white. But anyway, I'd encourage you to have a look at that study by Croucher for yourselves. Interestingly, Paul Harper, a colleague who's a fantastic, I think he's at UQ, does great work in disability, mentioned that in their audit, there's no senior leader in the sector who publicly shares that they are a professional or an academic with a disability. And I think that's an interesting reflection and one for us to think about. In 2021, we had 10 university vice-chancellors who were women. I'm sure that number has changed, but apologies, I didn't have time to update and Google that one. More broadly in the tertiary education sector, it's about 30% of women are at the CEO level. Okay, so I would argue it doesn't really paint a particularly diverse picture of where power resides within our sector. Okay? Now, I would then argue that because of that, equity-mindedness in leadership is critical, all right? Given what I've just spoken about, it's important that in terms of equity-mindedness leadership, we're conscious of the inequities that we've seen there. We're conscious of the exclusionary patterns and behaviours that happen in policy and culture in our institutions and educational organisations. And perhaps more importantly, we have to have a willingness to identify our own privilege and leverage that privilege to be able to give people seats at the table. All right? Now, I'm going to talk about Indigenous stuff to frame this conversation because I can, but I think it's also important that we reflect on that. As I said, it takes action to fix these things, so we actually need to do stuff. So I want to reflect on Indigenous presence in the academy quickly. In 2009, out of the 37 then universities, we had one Indigenous person at a PVC or DVC level. Now, most recently, of the 36 universities, we have 28 Aboriginal people who are at PVC or DVC level, which is fantastic. Fantastic to see. Now, some, but not all, are on university executive, okay? So that's a really important table. Any executive is an important table, but we have to know that of those 28, not everybody sits at the key decision-making table. So again, reflecting on power, where does power reside, where does it not reside? And I think it's probably important to recognise also that a handful of those Aboriginal staff, including myself, occupy roles that are not Indigenous specific, and I think that's a promising thing to see. So reflecting on Indigenous presence in the academy, I now want to reflect on the pipeline into the academy, but not in the way you might think. I want to talk about schools, right? If we're thinking about equity, I think I want to go right back. And the reason why I want to do that is because I think as a sector, we probably need to think less inwardly, right? We need to think about equity in a really broad scope way. So I want to really focus on the schooling context because I was a school teacher, a high school teacher, and that's still very important to me. So in terms of reading, I picked reading as one of the major kind of measures around how we go in terms of educational outcomes. At Year 3, Aboriginal kids are about 83% are at or above the national minimum standard for reading. By Year 5, that goes to 78.5. By Year 7, 76.6. But I had to pause for drama there. By Year 9, 67.2. And then by the time we get to Year 12, we see attainment rates nationally that are about 57% for secondary schooling. So when we think about equity, it's not just about the blackfellas, the students that rock up to our organisations. We need to understand that that's an entire journey where equity can be deployed to make a difference. So in short, the student pipeline becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, until what we see is that from the school to the university, that's my university at the bottom there, just to keep you across. But I think one of the things that we struggle with is that in trying to understand the outcomes when it comes to Indigenous kids, we focus on that's a house, right? We focus on what's going on at home instead of focusing what's going on at schools. And if we scan the literature quickly to see what is going on within the schools, what is going on in spaces like that, we know that racism and poor understandings of racism within educational environments are a major hindrance to Aboriginal kids throughout their schooling. Teachers have low expectations of our kids. I was told maybe I should go to TAFE and become a mechanic. Now, this little gay boy was not going to go off and become a mechanic. All right? I'm here living my Britney fantasy. Vocational pathways are still seen as the default option for Indigenous kids in school, so university is often still not seen as something that we're progressing to. And we often talk about undesirable schools. We kind of know what that means. Interestingly, Indigenous kids also, research has shown, perceive themselves as being less capable, but interestingly more capable than some of their teachers. That's scary, right? We teach those teachers to teach our kids. I reckon when I finished my secondary degree, I reckon there would have been a quarter of the cohort that I would have felt comfortable letting anywhere near my family. I think that's important for us to remember. We have the exposure to negative narratives by teachers. Aboriginal kids are less likely to know about post-school options, and of course we have a distrust of educational systems. The focus is on about getting kids to school, but there's not a lot of focus on what Aboriginal families do to get their kids through school and get them to enjoy it and appreciate what lifelong learning can be. So the question we ask ourselves is not what can we do about these systemic issues, we ask ourselves, but how can we attract more Indigenous students into uni? That's a question we ask ourselves all the time. So what are we doing about this? We're educating, we're indigenising curriculum. 50% of us say we are, 15% actually do it. All right, self-reported UA report, have a look at it. We have pathway programs, we have outreach and engagement activities, so we're doing some work, right, within the remit, our scope of work. I think it's important to recognise we're a $35 billion industry and sector, all right, in terms of, and we're growing as we heard today. We have dedicated fundings, Indigenous Regional Low SES Attainment Fund of around $200 million, ISSP $72 million across the sector, which equates to being about $2,300 per Aboriginal student in the country, not a lot, and of course disability support program funding. So we have targeted ways of working. Now if we look at HEP in the past, the target for equity spending under the Bradley Review was to sit around 4%. We never really got there. We got to about 1.8 last year if we kind of single out the legacy of HEP. So you could kind of argue at best 1.8% was spent on creating a fairer future. I might be being a bit harsh here, okay, but let's just run with it. In the evaluation of HEP, it was found that it was not clear the extent to some of the programs that were funded were considered additional to what would ordinarily be implemented by universities. All right? So I think we need to reflect on that finding a lot. And if we acknowledge that equity is about reprioritising, are we really doing equity then? Only 8 universities in Australia, when I looked, this is about a year ago, it might have changed, only 8 universities had mentioned equity in their strategic plan. And we know generally what's in the strategic plan gets funded, most of the time, right? Most of the time, depending on how we're going, okay? But it signals priority and importance. So I think we must have the courage to ensure that equity is understood as part of our core business. It's not an additional bolted-on extra. We must have the courage to budget for equity at sector, institutional and local levels. As the DVC equity, people come to me and say, Braden, we need to do this training, do you have some money? I say, no, did you put it in your budget? No. Okay? So we need to be able to do that at all levels. I talked about the relationships and responsibilities, but I think most importantly, we have to have the courage to reimagine what an equitable and just higher education system looks like. And we can't be preoccupied by looking inward all the time. The Minister said where you live, how much your parents earn, whether you're Indigenous or not, is still a major factor in whether you're a student or a graduate at an Australian university. Just over 70% of students walk out with a qualification, but it's lower if you come from a poor family, regional remote, or you are Indigenous. I think the O'Kane review is a really exciting opportunity and a way in which we can have extraordinary impact to reimagine our ways of working in equity. And I kind of just a provocation, what if we spent, 5% of our sector worth on equity? What could we do? What could we achieve? I'll take 1% per year, compound to, a certain period of time. But it will allow us to work in intersectional ways. We know students with disability in school do not receive the support that they need. We know that 60% of LGBTQ+ kids feel unsafe in their schools. 1 in 4 have attempted suicide. We know that international students experience ethnic accent bullying, linguistic stereotyping. My husband's French, he'll tell you what that's like, and he's a white man, so he knows how difficult that can be. And students who are educated first in family, who are not first in family, are 2 times more likely to go to university. We know these things. Regional remote, 40% less likely to gain a high-level tertiary qualification. And if we think about ATAR, in WA at least, there's still a tight positive correlation between the socioeconomic well-being, socioeconomic advantage of a school and the ATAR attainment rate. Now, despite these structural issues, our students persist and they thrive at ECU. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be a little bit quick, but the points I wanted to make is that access and enabling is exceptionally important. We need to carry that forward in whatever comes next. At ECU, our enabling students do just as well as every other cohort who comes in through a domestic pathway, and we need to remember that. They also become professors. You can see the success rate. I'll share these slides later on. A major equity initiative that's having success at ECU is the progression rates of our Aboriginal kids. Right? Our KPI is to get to parity with domestic, and we're getting there because of clearly funded equity initiatives that are getting us there, led by Aboriginal leadership, which is really important. And you can see, I don't know who those other universities are, but you can see our trend lines. Not that I'm competitive, okay, but you can see where we're going. This shows you how important Indigenous specialist supports are. The ATMP is ITAS, for many of you who might know it. It's a one-on-one tutorial support. It's the most used. It's also the most effective. Other past learning advisor studiosities, we don't see the engagement as much. So the importance of Indigenous leadership in that is really cool, really important. So what is our role as a sector in the context of accelerating social change? I'm going to flick through some very quick things. We talked about TikTok. I don't think we're the sole site of transformative learning and social change discourse anymore. Black Lives Matter, we heard mentioned, climate change has been a theme, queer rights, dealing with issues around the patriarchal culture we all live in, mental health, colonialism, etc. People are learning this now on TikTok. Okay? We have Aboriginal kids who are talking about the politics of their lives that's accessible to a lot more people in the past. We have trans people inviting us into their bedrooms to talk about what their life is like as a young person. I don't think we're keeping pace with that, and we probably need to think about how we do it. These principles are everyday understandings for these kids now, right? They're coming in with it. And are we keeping up? Are our academics keeping up? I'm not sure. But unless we think about these systemic and structural barriers, they will continue to shape who we are, how we are perceived, And basically, our identity as a sector, I still think we're not prosecuting clearly enough why we should exist and why we should be important to many people in our community. So our students must expect to focus on equity. We have to measure our success by the transformative impact that we have on society, and we must look like the communities that we serve. We must also work within and beyond the physical environment and digital environment of our campuses. We must measure our success by how well our sector does equity. And I want to finish by a quote from Bell Hooks, which I think is a really nice framing as we move into a really amazing time for our sector to think about the future. Is to be truly visionary, we have to root our imagination in our concrete reality, while simultaneously imagining possibilities beyond that reality. And that's our task now as a sector, and that's a really, really exciting future. So thank you very much.